Welcome to Face to Face, connecting theater makers to the public, a program from the Legacy Theater and socialdistancetheater.org.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest today is a Tony Award-winning performer who has appeared and starred in many Broadway shows, including Les Misérables, They're Playing Our Song, Blues in the Night, Zorba, Chicago, and Jerome Robbins Broadway. She has worked extensively with Jerome Robbins, Marvin Hamlisch, and Stephen Schwartz. She has had an extensive concert career performing with symphonies all around the world, which led to a new branch of her career in producing and booking concerts for her Broadway colleagues. I am so pleased to welcome Debbie Gravitte. Hi, Debbie. How are you doing?
Hi, Tess. So great to be here with you.
How have you been holding up in quarantine?
You know, that's going to be the $1 trillion question that everybody gets asked after we all survive through all this. I think so. It's funny because I was speaking to my daughter about it this morning, and I realized that so much of it has to do with where we have spent this time. And I'm lucky to be staying in this beautiful part of Connecticut and watching spring unfold. And there's food in our house, and I feel very, very grateful for that. And I've had my whole family here with me, including my 3 now adult children. So it's all been like interesting.
You're at home with a family of artists. What has that been like? Your husband, Bo, is the artistic director of the Actors Studio. Your son, Sam, was starring as Fiyero in Wicked on Broadway up until COVID hit and the Broadway shut down. And your daughter, Ellie, is a filmmaker, and you have another adult child, as you mentioned. So what has it been like living with a family of artists in one house?
Well, I don't have to tell you that it's been pretty emotional. You know, it's been fascinating to understand how important performance is in my life, in my son's life, how it relates to my husband and my daughter. But the fact that we don't have an outlet to do what we do except through like Zoom and FaceTime and online things, but the chance to be in a room with people and experiencing laughter and applause and the thrill of the common performance, that's sort of tested all of us at different times. It's made me understand how much performance is so important to me. I think that this has been a great time for everybody to sort of reflect on things in their lives, you know, to sort of take a look in, because we're sort of all we have right now. And for me, one of the biggest things was that I realized how much I do miss performing.
I was talking to someone the other day, and we were just talking about taking for granted the ability to perform for a room of people and to have that collective experience in the theater.
Yes.
And that we as performing artists, that's been a wake-up call during all of this.
Absolutely. And so what's great to me is I think that when this is finally really over, and it's not at all near over because there's just so much unknown, when we can all say, remember when that happened, which hopefully won't be too far away, when we can all gather together, I think people really will want to be gathering together, and therefore I think the arts will flourish. That's my like sort of wish and prayer and hope and feeling.
Me too. And you have had this extensive concert career that has led into a new branch for you, which has been producing and booking many of your colleagues' shows. Have you been able to book right now, or are venues kind of waiting to hear about the effects of social media?
Yeah, everything that involves me personally. So I have sort of like this dual life. So I have the shows that I am booked in by other people. Mm-hmm. And then I have the shows that I'm booked in by myself and my my people that I've hired to do these shows. And everything right now is just on a big pause button. It's just nobody is quite sure what to do. It keeps getting like the can keeps getting cooked, kicked down the road. So concerts I have, I had in March, April, May, those have now been moved to the fall, but nobody knows if those will even happen. And in fact, last night I got an email about somebody trying to push things to the end of 2021. And I think that that's what's going to keep happening. Everything's just going to sort of keep pushing. I think that if we're in the theater, if we're in the performing arts, we're all ridiculous optimists. So we all think it's going to happen. But the reality is it's probably going to get pushed until, probably my guess is until there is a vaccine and people really know that it's safe. That's my guess based on absolutely no facts whatsoever.
No, I kind of agree, unfortunately. Before this happened, though, you were able to book your own shows into venues. And I'm curious as to what it was like wearing those two hats for yourself and not just booking some of your big name colleagues, but also booking your own show and what kind of fulfillment that's brought you.
Well, it's so funny. I had never done anything like this. I've always been on the performing end of the aisle. And when I started my company, which is it's really only about a year and a half, one of our sort of mission statements was that we have been on both sides of the aisle. And it's been a fascinating journey to know what I know from the performance side, from sitting in a dressing room waiting for them to bring us water, or is there a steamer around, or asking for things that you feel embarrassed to ask about, to understanding that contractually the other side of it, so that I make sure that my artists are provided for. I mean, it's this is a stupid thing talking about a clothes steamer, but the things that seem so important when you're getting ready to perform, it's so wonderful to go, wow, and I'm going to make sure that they have M&Ms in their dressing rooms or whatever it is. And the funny part is that when I started the company, it really was, well, I'm going to just book. I have a show called Big Band Broadway. I recorded an album called Big Band Broadway. And my symphony manager had said, well, why don't you just, book that yourself into performing arts centers? And I went, okay, I will. And what I've discovered is that it's much easier for me to hype up and talk about my other artists than it is about myself. Now people want it, and that's great. But, it's so funny how we're performing artists and we're going, how do I look? How do I sound? Did you like me? How was I? And at the same time, it's easier for me to go, wow, Tess Adams has this amazing show and you really need to have it, as opposed to my show. So lesson learned there.
Let's backtrack a little bit, because you've had such a fascinating and expansive career. And I wanted to kind of touch on a bit of everything that you've done. You grew up in Los Angeles and you made your Broadway debut as an original cast member of They're Playing Our Song. How old were you when you moved to New York, and how did you get that first breakout gig?
So I was in Los Angeles, and I did a show called Annie Get Your Gun, and it starred Debbie Reynolds. Debbie Reynolds was a huge star in the 50s. Well, you probably know who it is, but maybe other people don't. And it starred Debbie Reynolds and Harve Presnell. It was directed by Gower Champion, who would, after the show, go on to direct 42nd Street and die opening night, but that's a whole other story. And his assistant, his associate choreographer, was a man named Tony Stevens. This is going deep. Basically what happened was that man and the musical director were doing a new Broadway show. And they came to me one day and they said, Debbie, wink, wink, we're doing this new Broadway show. Will you fly to New York and audition for it? And I went, oh, okay, not understanding that, of course, I was going to get it. So I got this new Broadway show, and it was the greatest moment of my life, and it closed in Washington, D.C., closed out of town. So I came back to LA, sort of got my, shit together, and I ended up moving to New York. Now, because of this experience, I also had an agent. I got a really great agent who said to me, it's going to take a while, you have to be patient. And in this show that had closed, I had met a man by the name of David James Carroll, who he lost to AIDS very early on, but he was climbing, and he told a director about me. And sure enough, I went in and auditioned. I moved to New York, and I guess I was like 24 or something. Wow. So I wasn't like, 19. I did other things in between that. I got there playing our song. Anyway, I moved when I was 23, I guess. And I got there playing our song when I was 24. Because I remember I celebrated.
The music for that show was written by late, great Marvin Hamlisch.
Yes, who you knew, of course.
Yes, and you went on to work extensively with him in concerts. You did many of his concerts. Did you interact much with him during that production?
It was the first new big Broadway show that I knew was going to happen because it was direct. It was, written by Neil Simon and the music by Marvin Hamlisch. And the budget, the money just didn't matter. And you knew that it was going to go to Broadway. And what was great also is that it went out of town. When it went out of town, it went to Los Angeles. So all my, family and friends could come see me do that. There were only 8 people in the cast. There were the 2 principals, and then there were 3 female and male voices. And of course, I was one of those. I also covered Lucy Arnaz, the star of it. I was her understudy. That's a whole other story. So creating a new show, yes, I wasn't really close with any of the big creatives because I was this young, like, oh my God, what's happening? It was all so new and grand. But the Marvin that I knew when I worked with him and they're playing our song was a different man than the man I subsequently did concerts with.
What do you think shifted?
Honestly, this is very odd to say, but I think that Marvin maybe either got counseling or went on some medication. He was, he definitely had issues sort of going up and down emotionally, and he was
like many artists do
together later. He was a very fascinating man. He was one of those artists who is temperamental, full of love and full of art, and therefore full of issues. I don't know any really successful, fantastically creative person who doesn't have something going on. It just seems to be the way that we're all built.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're playing our song, and then you go on to do several other Broadway shows, Blues in the Night, Zorba, and then you land Jerome Robbins Broadway, which was a really interesting production because it was a kind of a compilation of Jerome Robbins' greatest hits. And as a director and choreographer, Jerome Robbins was nominated for many awards, which included your nomination for Best Featured Actress. And so I just would love to hear what it was like working with him and also doing a show that was uniquely comprised of other iconic works.
It was absolutely one of the greatest experiences of my life. We rehearsed for 6 months. I loved Jerry Robbins, who was, again, a very, very complicated person. He had a lot of issues. In 1964, there was the communists. People were afraid of communists, and there was the House Un-American Activities Committee, and Jerry Robbins had actually named names, basically because he didn't want people to know he was gay. I mean, it's talk about a complicated time. And so a lot of people had turned against him, older people of his age, and we were all very young and didn't know any of this. So I think that he really had the time of his life doing it. He sort of did the company. There were 64 of us on stage, and he sort of divided us up into, it was like a ballet company in terms of there were sort of the principals, the soloists, and the corps. Now that's not the way it was because it was a Broadway show, but he put it this way, he ended every rehearsal. We began every rehearsal with dance class, mandatory, which was fantastic. Because talk about being in the greatest shape of my life. Thank you.
Did you dance growing up?
I did. I did. And then I just sort of let that peter out, much to my chagrin. I don't really believe in like regrets. I don't, because what good does that do any of us? But I get wistful when I think, why did I stop taking dance class? Because when I first came to New York, people thought I was a dancer, or as my kids say, Mom, we know that you were a really good mover. So, you know, I've always like moved well in everything I've done. That's been a part of what I've done. Anyway, it was the greatest. It was a really, really fantastic time. And I loved him, loved the company. It was a game changer for me. And then of course I won the Tony Award doing the show. And that, you know, that also changes everything.
When you were working on it, did you maybe not expect for yourself, but was there the feeling of this is an award-winning show, or this is something really special when you were working on it?
I think I found through all the Broadway shows I've done, the original productions, maybe the older you get, you start thinking about the consequences of, ooh, are we going to, you know, be nominated and win Tony Awards? But I think when you're in the original inception and creation of what you're doing, you really just want it to be good. And then I think we all know in the back of our minds that then the Tonys will follow that. So we just were, we knew it was something special because you're talking about some of the greatest works of Broadway of our history, Gypsy and West Side Story and Fiddler on the Roof and Peter Pan and On the Town. And a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. I mean, it's endless. The shows that Jerry Robbins directed or choreographed or had something to do with. So therefore, you were immediately working with history. And what Jerry came in and did was, you know, he said, we're not just gonna learn the steps. So we really created the moments that these numbers came out of. So that's why I think for the audience members, when they saw the show, I know this was the experience for my husband. Obviously, I didn't see the show because I was in it, but you were in the moment of each particular show. And that's what Jerry, he was a perfectionist, and it was maddening and fantastic all at the same time.
One question that I was going to ask you was about your process in being a part of original creation versus stepping into something like Les Misérables, which you played Fantine and you stepped in, it was already going. So I'm wondering for this show in particular, because it was kind of an interesting combination of like this original creation that was comprised of things that were very iconic that maybe people had very specific ideas of.
Right.
Did he stick to very strict outlines of what those shows had been, or was there more a creative molding of them?
No, he was always willing to do the new. The steps are the steps. The choreography is the choreography. And some of it was written down, notated. Others he had to sort of redo. He was willing to change things depending on the people. The steps in a West Side Story, let's say, those were the steps. but how he got to the steps was always fascinating. And besides the fact that he was the greatest performer I had ever seen in my life. He could be Peter Pan and Riff and Bernardo and Tessie the stripper and Mazeppa the stripper. He could be anything. He inhabited these roles so fully. He was a really, really good actor. In fact, he participated in the actor studio. He was a really good, smart actor. And therefore, that's why everything he did was so organic and came out of that.
So going back to the question before, what has been the difference for you in experiencing the original creation of a new piece, like They're Playing Our Song, or you've done world premieres regionally as well, versus stepping into a role and making it your own within?
Right. Well, I've just done it. I've done it twice. I did it in Les Mis, and of course, just incredibly, talk about iconic role of Fantine. The funny part about it was that I actually, literally the day I was starting rehearsal, found out I was pregnant. And then a week after that, a week before I was going to debut, I was slated to do 4 months. They would bring in like guest stars to do these 4-month slots, and I was doing Fantine. So then the next week I found out I was actually having twins. So first of all, I was the healthiest, most zoftig Fantine you've ever seen, because I was literally just growing children inside me. And I actually only lasted 2.5 months because my doctor came and said, you can't do it because they're throwing you around on stage. So, but I found it fascinating. It was the first time I was replacing in a show, was Les Mis. And to be really honest with you, I loved doing the show, but I did not like being a replacement in that. Because with Les Mis, which I know you also did, it was the first time that I knew of that they brought over the idea of tracks. And tracks, for people who don't know, is, basically the role that people play in each show. But I understood for the first time that Les Mis, like many shows that are now and would become, was a bit of a machine. And so I feel really good and great about the fact that I rarely ever missed shows in my life. I just was always like, you go on, no matter what's happening, you go on. Well, one day I came into Les Mis, and I think we had done a matinee, and I really was sick, from the pregnant part. And I went, I don't think I can do the show. And within 8 seconds, the stage manager said, okay, here's what we're going to do. And Blankety Blank is going to do this track, and Blankety Blank is going to do that track. And I remember feeling, wow, it doesn't really matter that I'm not going to be here. I felt not as special as I wanted to feel. Like, oh, Debbie, what will we do without you? And it really wasn't that. It was just like the show had to go on. So that was interesting. And then the other show I replaced in was Chicago, where I had a different experience, which was I came in and they taught me the show. I was going to open the show with Patrick Swayze. He and I were going to both go into Chicago. And they taught me word for word and line for line, and put your finger here and your nose. And as I did the show, again, I did it for 4 months, I grew into my own performance of that. And then, so it didn't start great, ended great for me. But it's a completely different set of rules when you step into a role than creating one.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that you kind of started creating, because I think a lot of people start the opposite way of, maybe their first role is stepping into
right
as an understudy or as a cover, and they are part of that machine, and then they get to do the creating later.
Right.
So creating has been a big part of your career. You're a recording artist and you've recorded 4 solo albums, your latest, Big Brand Broadway.
Woo! Say that 4 times. Big Brand Broadway.
Big Brand. What's it like taking an album and transposing it into a nightclub act or a cabaret act?
Well, you know, as artists, we have to constantly keep reinventing ourselves. And so I've always, I mean, I just, you know, I'm a musical theater babe. I don't make any pretense. It's what I love. I'm a big Broadway broad. I'm sort of basically what I've been my entire life. Like nothing's really changed. I didn't have to go from being an ingenue to what I am now. This is just what it's always been. And I've also always loved big band music. So, you know, you're always trying to figure out how can I, you know, we don't sell millions of albums when we're theater performers. We just, that's not the reach of our audience, unless you're very, very, you know, lucky with the select few people. But so I always loved big band music, and I sort of put this thing together, and it was like Broadway and big band and put it together. And of course, it was an obvious fit to perform live because people like to hear a big band. So, I mean, that's basically how that happened. I mean, you know, in between, it's so funny, we're talking about the Broadway shows I did, and I was going, what did I do after that? And I went, this is when I would turn to nightclubs, clubbing, and I would do like some show I made up. And which was a great thing, because when you're performing in a club situation, as opposed to you break the fourth wall, and you have to talk and be there with the audience in a completely different way than you are in a theatrical piece.
Yeah. And some people, myself included, that is a very difficult medium to really be confident in yourself and breaking that fourth wall, as opposed to stepping into a character and kind of hiding behind the character. There's no hiding, it's just you.
You have to like look people in the eye when you are doing your own show. You know, there's no getting away with that. You have to be, I mean, obviously when we do theater, the audience is a part of it. They are a part of it, and we don't know what's going to happen. A light's going to fall, an actor's going to trip, someone's going to forget a line. But we sort of like keep moving on in that experience of it. But obviously, when you're singing to, you know, 100 people, it's a completely different thing, which I love. I love them both.
Did you always have that confidence and sense of yourself? I love that you said you make no pretenses and like you've been who you've always been. But did that come naturally, or did you?
I think it did. I mean, honestly, I was loud. I was personable. You know, I watch a lot of young people today, and people ask, and, you know, how do you do this and that? And I think that you can learn and you can become the best at what you do, and you can take classes and lessons and learn about the world and all these great things. But I think there also is sort of a little bit of magic pixie dust that is sprayed on some people more than others. And I think that I do and did have that. And there was nothing else I wanted to do. I had no other real interests. I mean, for 5 minutes, I wanted to be an Olympic swimmer, but that wasn't going to happen. So, yeah, I guess I never really doubted myself. Of course, you always have doubts when you're auditioning. Who doesn't walk in going, oh my God, I hope I get it. Was I any good? And I mean, everybody does that. We all question that. But when I know what I'm doing, I do feel really confident. And that's a wonderful thing.
It is, and you definitely have that. You've made it a huge part of your career and have been able to perform with symphony orchestras all over the world. You've sung in Moscow, in London, Stockholm, Munich, Jerusalem, and those are just symphonic concerts. You've also performed at famous venues such as Rainbow and the Stars, 54 Below, Birdland. There's so many, so I'm not going to name them all. But do you have any crazy stories from all of your years of traveling and performing and all the wonderful people you've worked with?
Wow. Well, I can just tell you, I mean, I'll think of something specific in a minute, but I'll tell you right now that I really, really miss traveling and talk about like learning things during this crazy time that we've lived through I mean, to go and sing, I got to sing in Beijing, China, with Long Long, the pianist. And we sang in this big place called the Temple of Heaven, very sacred. It's in the Forbidden City. And it was sort of mind-blowing to do. I sang in Moscow. It was fascinating to be in Moscow and just see people who looked exactly like me, who spoke a really funny language that I had absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever. I mean, I think that traveling to these incredible cities has been so eye-opening, and it just, again, makes you a better performer. I mean, you know, the time we were singing and it started raining, the time that they had to cancel because the wind instruments, it was too cold for the wind instruments. So this was in Central Park. Wow. With Skitch Henderson, this conductor of the New York Pops. And I was actually replacing somebody who had canceled, and we rehearsed, and then the wind instruments went, it's too cold, we can't do it. And they went, okay, we're just gonna do it with piano, bass, and drums. And then like, here came this like trumpet player who said, I don't care. And he started performing, and we sang, and it was, you know, fabulous because we just made it happen because we couldn't help ourselves. Nobody wants to cancel anything.
And that evolved partly because of your passion for it, but also you're a mother of 3, which is a huge job. That's a full-time job in and of itself. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, that schedule allowed you more time at home in some ways, because as opposed to going to the city and doing a Broadway show every night, sometimes twice a day.
Yeah. So the last show I did on Broadway was Chicago. And I realized right then and there that if I want to be a part of my children's lives, 8 shows a week wasn't going to do it. It just wasn't. I was missing basically everything. You know, I was awake when they were asleep and vice versa, and missing everything. And with concerts, what it's done is it allowed me and allows me to not work as many days. And that's really why I got into this world. And even though I miss doing, you know, Broadway shows, I don't miss, people don't really understand from both sides what doing a Broadway show is. It is I remember this friend of mine I grew up with came to New York. Early on, I don't know what show I was doing, maybe Zorba. I had just met my soon-to-be husband, and we went out to, you know, dinner with Linda Gach and her boyfriend or husband, whatever at the time. And she said, well, what do you do all day? And I was so taken aback by that, because when you're on Broadway, you have to, like, you know, you still have to do your laundry and go to the market and cook food, but you also have to take care of your body and your voice and your spirit, and you're maybe working on something else. I mean, it's more than a full-time job, and I think people really need to appreciate that.
What is your self-care routine, and what has been your self-care routine? Does it vary when you're doing 8 shows a week versus traveling sometimes halfway across the world and performing with a symphony orchestra, maybe doing like 3 or 4 shows that weekend?
Right. Well, I find that if I'm doing 8 shows a week, it's very different than doing 1 or 2 or 3 concerts. First of all, in a concert, you can go on the stage and off the stage. On the stage, you can get a glass of water and you can sort of compose yourself and prepare in a different way than if you're doing a show where you're maybe doing a costume change, then you have to be right back on stage. I find that if I'm doing 8 shows a week, I am living like a nun. I'm not speaking to people. You have to really take care of yourself in a much different way. I always have to do a physical warm up before I warm up my voice. It's, I do that anyway when I'm singing anytime. That's very connected for me.
So we've talked about Jerome Robbins. We've talked a bit about Marvin Hamlisch. I want to talk about Stephen Schwartz and your relationship with him and your relationship to his music, because I'll let you tell the story, but you have a very special relationship with the Wicked music.
I do. It's for so many ways. Basically, I got a call from Stephen Schwartz. We live in the same little fairy tale town in Connecticut. And I got a call from Stephen Schwartz. And he said, I'm going to go do some concerts. Would you, join me? So it was a guy by the name of Scott Coulter and myself. And we did a little touring with Stephen Schwartz. Now, Stephen Schwartz at the time hadn't even written Wicked. He was in the process of writing Wicked. And lo and behold, like a few months after that, he came to me and he said, I'm working on the show called Wicked. And I have this new song, and will you learn it and sing it in our nightclub act or whatever it was, our show, our concert. And so I went over to his beautiful house, and he took out this, music of like 79 pages. And I sat at the piano and he sang Defying Gravity. And I learned Defying Gravity. I was the first person to sing Defying Gravity. And it was spectacular. And he is not only an amazing writer, composer, lyricist, he's such a great teacher and mentor to so many people. He's one of the most generous men I've ever met. When I was doing a concert with him in East Hampton, New York, my son Sam came with me, very clever of him, and Stephen saw him and physically said, he actually took me, he came into the bathroom where I was getting ready, very glamorous, for our concert, and he said, Debbie, I don't want to embarrass Sam, but he's really right for Fierro. We're trying to go younger. And my son had just graduated from college. And I said, do you think he'd mind singing for me? And I was like, do you think he'd mind? And yes. So anyway, Sam ended up singing for Stephen, and that put him in the way of getting into the tour of Wicked. And then subsequently, he's now starring on Broadway when it resumes as Fierro. So we love Stephen Schwartz in my house.
You mentioned that you're a Connecticut local, and I just wanted to bring that up because this new theater that Legacy is opening is in Branford, and you and your husband and your family have done so much to support the Richfield theater community.
We need to come to Branford.
I know. So the last thing that I want to say is just thank you so much for your time and for sharing all of your wonderful wisdom and stories and bits about your fascinating life with us. We're so lucky to have you, Debbie.
Thank you, Tess.
Thank you for joining us on Face to Face. We would like to thank our sponsors, Oak Tree Development and the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and Brad Ross for the themed music. You can follow us on legacytheaterct.org.